You are listening to WonderLabs, filling your ear holes with nerdy goodness.
Hello and welcome to WonderLabs. I'm Ellie Mackay.
And I'm Chris Richardson.
In this episode, we speak with Chris Timmermann. Chris is a researcher at Imperial College's Psychedelic Research Group, a group looking at the therapeutic applications of psychedelic compounds in mental health, as well as broader research into the nature of human consciousness. In this episode, we explore his work on the so-called spirit molecule, dimethyltryptamine, or DMT.
We look at the pharmacology and historical use of DMT across cultures, and what brain imaging studies reveal about brain activity during the psychedelic experience. We also discuss consciousness, the challenges of conducting studies involving these compounds, and the link of psychedelic experiences to activities like meditation.
Chris's supervisors, David Nutt and Robin Carhart-Harris, are often in the media for their unorthodox approaches, and this was a fascinating conversation with a group that isn't afraid to court controversy in the name of scientific exploration.
As a long-time follower of this group's work, it was fantastic to have Chris along to speak about it in more detail, and we hope you enjoy hearing about it too. Chris, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Could you just kick things off by telling us a bit about your background, where you're from and how you came to be doing what you're doing right now?
So I studied psychology. I'm from Chile. I studied psychology there. I worked as a psychologist for a couple of years. I wasn't really excited about the things that I was doing, and I wanted to get into neuroscience a bit. I managed to get into university in Bologna, in Italy. So I studied cognitive neuroscience there. And while I was studying there, I've always had this incredibly strong fascination about psychedelic drugs and how can they inform us about process of consciousness or how they offer a new novel way to look at those mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So while I was doing my master's in Bologna, I went to this conference here in London about psychedelic research.
Breaking Convention or something?
Breaking Convention, yeah. And I did that 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. And in the convention, basically, I reconnected to the whole world of psychedelic research, and I found out about all the things that were going on. And that basically propelled me to pursue a PhD in neuroscience.
The psychedelics team at Imperial, there's quite a lot of media coverage at the moment with the various psychedelic compounds on which they're working. So psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, and LSD. But your work is focused on a molecule known as DMT.
Exactly.
That's dimethyltryptamine.
Exactly.
You talk a little bit about your current research questions.
Sure. Also, it's important to get a bit of context. It's we focus in the team on two big areas. Mm-hmm. One is the clinical research, and the other one is more kind of associated to neuroscience or consciousness research, if you will. Mm-hmm. So what you mentioned, a lot of the work that's been done lately by the lab with psilocybin, the work that Robin has been leading, has centered a lot about in the clinical aspects as of late. Mm-hmm. There's neuroimaging involved in that as well, but the strong focus is how can we use this as a tool to treat depression. Mm-hmm. And the other side is consciousness research, and the project that it's currently active right now, it's the one that I'm leading at the moment, which is with DMT, or dimethyltryptamine. And going back to your question, so DMT is a naturally occurring compound. It's a molecule that it's present in various plant species. Mm-hmm. There's also evidence pointing towards that we produce it endogenously in our bodies. Mm.
What do you mean by endogenously?
That it's produced in our body. Okay. There's some evidence pointing towards that, yeah.
So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the structure and the chemistry of this, because it's actually a very simple compound, isn't it? It's actually quite a straightforward compound. Mm-hmm.
What I can tell you is that it's a molecule that's highly similar to serotonin. So there's just two groups in the molecule that just differ from the serotonin molecule.
So would you say this is categorized in sort of the same family as serotonins?
It's considered a tryptamine psychedelic. Mm-hmm.
That's TRYP, not TRIP, right?
Exactly, tryptamine. Highly similar in its structure to serotonin. Mm-hmm. It's basically the precursor of tryptamine is tryptophan, and tryptophan is something that's you can find in food.
And this is an amino acid, isn't it? Tryptophan.
Yeah.
So this is worth, I think, people knowing about, that this is very, very similar molecule to a standardly produced, universally present amino acid. And to change a molecule from tryptophan amino acid into DMT only requires a couple of enzymatic reactions.
Exactly.
And
it's a couple of steps. Yeah.
And we have those enzymes in our systems.
Yeah.
So we are capable of naturally producing this
Exactly.
compound in our bodies.
Yeah.
To me, that seems really unusual that there's this compound that's found universally in lots of different types of trees and in mammals and in us. I mean, that must mean that there's this evolutionary retention of this molecule. Do you know why this DMT is found in so many places?
In terms of the function, we really don't know. And the thing is that we produce it in very, very minute amounts.
Right.
So recently, a review paper just came out by Dave Nichols. Dave Nichols is kind of like this historical animal psychedelic researcher that studied psychedelic compounds in animal research. And he basically reviewed all the evidence that came out of the endogenous DMT. And because there are a lot of theories, ever since it was discovered, it was somehow attached to a possible function.
So the fact that it seems to be present in so many different plant species, it's perhaps not too surprising then that several indigenous cultures have managed to stumble across it and find ways of extracting it and preparing it in different brews to use ritualistically. So ayahuasca being prepared in the Amazon, for instance. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So, yeah, the basic idea is that DMT is part of the ayahuasca brew. Ayahuasca is this brew that has been used, as far as we know, for centuries in the Amazon. And ayahuasca is generally, there are varieties of types of ayahuasca. It's a combination, generally, of a plant containing DMT and a vine that contains other, compounds, the beta-carbolines. So this is harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine, which are kind of like, they're a different class of compounds.
Right.
And these two combined, the main idea is that when DMT is taken orally alone, it's quickly destroyed by an enzyme in the gut.
It's monoamine oxidase.
Exactly, yeah, the MAO. And when it's taken in combination with the vine inhibits the activity of the enzyme.
When you take DMT, instead of the body metabolizing it very quickly, you take it in combination with this monoamine oxidase inhibitor that stops the body from breaking it down quickly.
Exactly.
And the effect of that would be that it would last for a much longer time in the body.
Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of like the main idea, how we currently understand it. There's a bit of evidence also pointing out that even if when you give ayahuasca to somebody, but you pre-treat with a compound that blocks the main activity of DMT, which is at the serotonin receptors in the brain, there's still an effect that can be seen in terms of psychological effect and in terms of brain effects. So there's...
So, sorry, just to clarify, so you're saying DMT, the way that it works is by binding to serotonin receptors?
Yeah, broadly speaking.
Yeah. So that just shows how similar it is to serotonin.
Exactly. Yeah. Highly similar. So basically all of the classic psychedelic drugs, the ones whose psychological effects are mediated by a specific receptor in the brain, and that is the serotonin 2A receptor.
Yeah.
And we know with pretty kind of like strong evidence by now that if you block that receptor, you pre-treat with an antagonist at that receptor site, you're blocking the effects of these drugs.
Yeah.
Right. But not entirely in the case of ayahuasca.
So there's a possibility, it's not conclusive, but it's a possibility that the psychoactive effects of ayahuasca, the other compounds also play a big role in that.
This isn't a recreational experience. This is something that's used medicinally by different cultures.
Well, it's interesting. I think it's quite more complicated than that, actually, because when you look at the traditional use of ayahuasca in Amazonian cultures, you see that the variety of purposes for what it was used is incredible, and it's quite interesting. So you do have healing purposes, diagnostic purposes, not, of course, in a scientific sort of like approach, but in a shamanistic sort of approach, So the ayahuasquero, the man doing the ritual, would take it himself so that he can understand the illness of the patient, many times physical. There's some evidence pointing out towards, for example, neurogenesis with some of these compounds.
So neurogenesis being
like
generation of neurons in the brain.
Yeah,
neurons,
exactly. Yeah. And there's some evidence also in terms of psychedelics in general having a potential for the conditions of generation of new brain cells as well. But going back to your question, I mean, other uses, you have really a wide variety. You have healing properties. You have some tribes that use it to kind of like have visionary insights to go hunting. You have other tribes that use it as black magic against other tribes and stuff like that. This was kind of like the belief systems that were around the uses, and it also shows the wide variety reality that you have within the Amazon.
Yeah, and indeed even sort of Western society now going and participating in those rituals also and bringing it back into their own culture and finding different uses for it.
I would say definitely the biggest approach that Western culture has taken on the whole ayahuasca phenomenon is the one in mental health. That is the way that it's currently being approached and the way that it's currently being explored from Western societies. Yeah.
I just wanted to start talking about these two areas really that you're looking at with DMT specifically in your research. You're looking into how this molecule actually works, the effect it has on the brain. So can you talk us through those different techniques that we'd use to measure what's happening and how, as a result of those techniques, how do we know what's going on in the brain? What's the actual effect?
There's two main techniques we're using for this study with DMT. One is called EEG, so electroencephalogram. Broadly speaking, what this technique allows, it gives you a very precise picture of when things are happening in the brain. So it has what you call a good temporal resolution.
Just to clarify, this is measuring the electrical
activity of
neurons.
Yeah. So patches of neurons working at the same time in the brain, you're able to pick up that current that they have in the scalp by placing an electrode.
Right.
So we have these EEG caps, we make participants wear that, and we give them DMT and placebo. And that gives us a good picture of the different rhythms in the brain and how these are modulated under the drug. And these different rhythms serve different sort of functions generally. And we have more and less clarity on those functions. So that's one technique. And the other one is called fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging.
Yeah.
And the information that gives to you is basically how metabolic activity in the brain. So what are the brain regions which are involved with energy consumption, and thus it is inferred that stronger energy consumption is related to stronger neural activity.
More activity.
So EEG then is a good temporal resolution, whereas fMRI is more of a good spatial resolution. And with those two things combined, you start to get a picture of what's actually happening inside the brain when somebody has taken DMT.
Exactly. So that is what we're doing. So we've already completed a study using just the EEG, and we actually only just yesterday we began the simultaneous EEG fMRI. So we're measuring EEG inside of the fMRI scanner. So we're getting this nice temporal and spatial resolution.
The fMRI is the one that quite often people hear about, the brain lighting up in different areas.
Yeah.
That's sort of what people might have heard of. And so you're looking at which areas of the brain are more active and when under different influences. Just a quick question. You say you give half of your people, you give them DMT and then you have a placebo. Yeah. What sort of doses are you giving them?
So we did have a first dose finding study, and we also measured EEG during that. But one of the main objectives of that study was characterizing what different doses do in terms of the experience. Because we are interested in kind of like mapping these phenomena in brain activity. So to do that, we need to find out what is an interesting dose. DMT is kind of like characterized by generating very particular experiences. So we wanted to get those experiences that we were really interested in really, inducing those phenomena.
You've got to have an effect that is going to show up in the brain.
Exactly. And also mapping that, but at the same time keeping it safe. So we gave a small dose, a medium dose, and a medium high dose.
And what did you find in the brain then, in terms of when you're looking at these EEGs and fMRIs? What's actually going on in the brain of someone?
So we have two kind of like big results from the EEG. One is that you have this alpha band power. So when the patches of neuron are acting on a frequency that's around 10 hertz, so it's spiking 10 times per second, right? You label that activity alpha. That's alpha power, and you can quantify the magnitude of the spiking. We see that this alpha frequency, which is highly active when people are with their eyes closed and they're not engaged in the external world.
More introspective, perhaps.
Yeah, they're kind of like a more introspective. There's a lot of interpretation around this alpha pattern as an inhibitory frequency. So you're paying attention to this side and the other side of the brain that's not corresponding to that activity. You see massive increases in alpha power, kind of like indicating that you're inhibiting activity that doesn't compete with that to which you're paying attention.
You're allowing your imagination to run free.
That's one way that you can interpret the results. So what we see is a huge decrease or desynchronization of this alpha power all over the scalp. So it's a massive, massive decrease in the alpha power.
Right.
And it's quite consistent with what we've seen with other psychedelic drugs. And the main idea, one possibility, is that this inhibitory function is you're disinhibiting basically activity in the brain. That's one interpretation. Yeah.
So it's almost like our brains all the time, we're running with the brakes on. We're constantly holding back the full potential of our brain activity, and this drug takes off those brakes.
So Huxley spoke about this in The Doors of Perception, this idea that the brain is potentially only tuned into things that it's evolutionarily geared towards. Beneficial for survival, irrespective of whether something is interesting or not for you as an individual. That's not what your brain is designed to do.
We've learned to ignore all of that or suppress it because we don't need it for our survival.
I think I would try being a bit more conservative on what the data is showing us.
Sure.
But those are interesting ideas. But I think the whole filtering valve of Huxley can also be interpreted as there are a lot of possibilities of internal processes are always happening, but they are constrained. Think about memories, imagination, creativity, etc. And these possibilities can become disinhibited. We need more data to get a better grip of what the evidence is showing us. The other main finding is that we find that when you measure the predictability of the signal or the diversity of the neural signal, you find that it's massively increased following DMT.
So it becomes less consistent, less regular.
Exactly. There's more information. It's more informationally richer. The innovation that we did in this study was that we asked people to give us some measure of how intense the experience was on every minute.
Now this is going to be my next question. How do you measure the subjective experience of somebody?
Yeah, it's an intravenous injection. What we're trying to generate with this injection is mimicking what the smoked DMT experience is, which is usually described as this very intense rocket launch experience that is very short as well. I mean, within 10 minutes, people have gone to the most extreme place and then come back. So going back to your question, we measure subjective experience. In this past study, we did it in 3 different ways. The typical way that you always go about it is that, you give people a series of questionnaires at the end of the experience. And then they retrospectively sort of examine what they went through. Right? In this study, we employed kind of like 2 innovations in that sense. And the first one was that we asked people to rate how intense the experience is on every minute.
That's interesting, just simply as a fact of the way that our memory changes, even 10 minutes after an event.
Right. We've spoken about that as well. This whole idea of the experiencing self versus the narrating self. And actually, as you said, when you're actually living an experience, the reporting element of that versus when you look back on something, even if it's been a particularly difficult or traumatic or challenging time, you can often see a positive...
Rose-tinted spectacles.
Yeah. So then, so this subjective reporting then...
What do you do with that? How does that feed into your research?
We used it as a way to see how it relates to the changes in brain activity also in real time. And we found that our 2 biggest results pretty nicely matched the subjective intensity.
Oh, no way.
So we see this decreases in the alpha, the inhibitory function, matching the subjective intensity, and we see this diversity of the neural signal, this entropy state, matching the intensity as well positively.
Oh, that's so cool.
What does this actually tell us about consciousness and the nature of consciousness?
It's not really resolving what you call the hard problem of consciousness. So this private experience, and how does that translate in observable stuff in the brain? It's like the redness of red, that's kind of like always been said as the hard problem of consciousness. You have this subjective quality of experience, and it just exists on that level, and doing the jump to brain activity relating to the redness of red or the blueness of blue is something that is it's a huge challenge. But in this scenario, I feel that psychedelic research might have important contributions. For example, this idea, that experience can be more intense, it can be more chaotic, it can be more busy, and you're seeing something about the richness of the information of the neural signal related to that. You're building that bridge a bit more. You're kind of like getting those two realms that are too difficult for them to marry, you're getting them closer together.
Which is great, and I think it's fantastic that you can use these molecules as tools in order to do so. But then taking a step back and looking more broadly then, what does that tell us? How does that help in this mystery that has vexed us for so long?
This idea that you're getting your objective measure and your subjective measure, and you're seeing that they're going together quite nicely. It's giving you a hint that you're getting a bit of a reading, you're getting a bit of a mapping of that change, that radical shift in the dynamics of the experience. You have an experience that it's wavy and it's moving and it's progressing, and you're seeing this roller coaster ride. You're building that story in terms of brain activity.
For sure. And in doing so, I suppose we're getting an increased and improved understanding, a more clearer picture of our own minds and what exactly is going on.
Yeah, hopefully.
So do you see a time far in the future where that divide between very clinical science with essentially what is spirituality and the soul? To support that, I wanted to quote Terence McKenna, who said that, going back to the DMT, it is the ultimate metaphysical reality pill. Mm-hmm. What do you take from that quote?
From that quote, I think Terence McKenna is referring to what many people have described as kind of like idea. There's kind of like a shock. What many people report is this radical sense of otherness. There is this huge sense that they are visiting somewhere else. You're going into this parallel dimension, and that this reality or this dimension has some sort of fundamental feel to it, has some sort of origin sense to that. There's something about this thing that feels extremely true, extremely familiar, extremely unique. If you read reports online about the DMT experience, you're going to find the kind of thing that I mentioned and the kind of thing that Terence McKenna usually speaks about quite frequently. In our research, we found a bit of variability in that. We found some commonalities, but in terms of this metaphysical aspect, many people did have it, but it wasn't the thing that really touched people necessarily strongest. It is more varied than people usually think. And I think that's also like another thing about the way that a story gets told a lot and how that influences people under these experiences.
The other thing I wanted to ask, just going back to your study, firstly, are these people who have willingly signed up because they're interested in that experience and therefore perhaps are more open to the idea of experiencing a metaphysical shift in their mind?
They always know, and we tend to get people who are experienced with the drug.
Right.
And that was my second question is, do you take participants who have never tried any drugs before or who are quite used to psychedelics? Something that someone else would rate as 1 would be 10 out of 10 in terms of intensity for me, because I've never experienced it before. So do you have a filter, some way of selecting your participants?
So we get people that are fairly experienced with the drug, and the main reason for that is basically safety.
Sure.
Safety, and then getting good interviews. The other measure that we're using an advanced interview technique. And what we're doing is like...
Sounds like the FBI, doesn't it?
It sounds like the
sounds
like the WonderLabs podcast.
Yeah. So what we're trying to do with this is we help people relive the experience. Try to put them in the same position that they were, going back to your senses.
Right.
And starting from that is how you build up this phenomenological space.
Yeah.
So that the narrating self becomes the experiencing self.
And that would be interesting to see if people's experience reliving being on DMT is anywhere near as close as the reality of it. And can you kind of recreate?
It's never going to be close.
I had more of a logistical question. So you're getting people to self-report every minute through this very powerful, intense experience.
Yeah.
And then they just sort of pop their jacket on and pop out the door and go walking around Hammersmith straight away. I mean, what's the sort of logistical protocol in terms of getting these volunteers into it? Sit them down, have a cup of tea and a biscuit.
We take a lot of care into making people feel comfortable before, and we take a lot of care in making sure that they're fine afterwards and they're ready to go home. And the way that we do that is that we're always with them. We have a relaxed environment. We have nice lights in the preparation room. We have music.
What music?
We play a lot of Brian Eno, ambient stuff.
Nice. You should get some Nicholas John. That would work well.
It's good. It's a bit more darkish, and we tend to avoid darkish stuff.
Yeah, does the environment around you change? Is that going to have an influence on your experience if you take this drug when there's some pretty dark music?
There's some stories going around, like the whole set and setting story on psychedelics is quite big, and everybody knows that is pretty much the case. I mean, somebody taking LSD in a party is different from taking LSD in the forest with a good person taking care of you. There's some stories going around, in the internet that DMT is a bit more insensitive because, as Terence McKenna says, there's this access to a metaphysical realm, so it doesn't really matter. I'm quite convinced that the context is hugely important.
Do you assess the psychological state and mood of the participants as well? Because would it affect the results if somebody was in, a very depressed state and they take it?
For sure, it's going to be different. Yeah, in our study, for example, we screen out people that we tend to have very, very healthy participants. But we do measure, changes in mood 1 week after, 2 weeks after.
Yeah, that was my other question is, what are the long-term lasting impacts of such a powerful chemical?
It's interesting. We follow them up for a week or so, and we get some questionnaires out. With the majority of participants that I've had the chance to run into again, it's pretty much consistent with what you find online generally, not always, but generally, is that when DMT is taken on its own, not in the ayahuasca form, this blast is so strong and so quick that it is difficult for people to get something out of it in the long run. I think there's an opening on the possibilities about what is reality, and not in a bad way, but just in a more flexible way. And in terms of clinical things, like you can have insights, some people have insights, but because it's so strong and you're in and you're out, it's not that easy for people to have kind of like a hugely lasting impact. But we do see increases in mood. Our data is showing that there's something that's affecting your mood.
This more detailed interview technique, what are the sort of results of that, and are you finding that to be a really successful methodology?
Well, yeah, we did it in collaboration with a colleague called Raphael Millier in Oxford. So he basically interviewed people in this first stage, and we were able to map out the progression of the experience. What we mapped out was that at the beginning, there is this full-on immersion, this kind of like strong rush that most people feel, and they feel it in their body quite strongly.
And this is within minutes or seconds of being injected? Within seconds,
like
wow.
When people are feeling the end of the injection, they start feeling this humongous
very
come
quick.
up. Yeah. For example, in the intravenous LSD study, people started feeling the effects still 15 to 30 minutes after.
Interesting.
So there's this rush at the beginning, and then people have this feeling that they're leaving their body, or they stop feeling their body. They feel that they're not in their body anymore. And usually it starts with simple visual imagery. So the geometrical patterns and stuff like that. And then people start seeing elaborate figures emerging from these geometrical patterns.
By figures, I mean entities.
Yeah. That there's this sense that there is someone there. And some people see them, some people don't see them, some people just have a strong sense. There's just someone.
And there's an interaction with that someone.
Yeah. So the typical thing is people are receiving information. Some people receive beautiful messages about relationships or lives, what they should do in the world, the origin of things, and things like that. Which
may help to explain this increase in sort of positive outlook in life. Perhaps that's what people are taking forward.
Yeah, exactly. And many people they're getting this strong sense of something true. And also during this bit, there's this feeling, there's like an elaborate world being created.
That's very similar to meditation. Have you ever explored the relationship between meditation and the psychedelic experience?
It's a very interesting topic, and I think a couple of colleagues are actually doing that right now. Some people, the usual thing that you hear is that a lot of people that use these compounds in the 60s later on went into the meditation route. The door is open, if you will.
Right.
I think that it's exciting, really, because we have these extraordinary experiences and we have these different methods. And I think it's pretty much an open question whether or not they are the same experience. I think it's truly exciting. I mean, the possibilities of really going into these experiences and trying to figure out, well, what are we talking about? Is it the same? Is it different? How does culture interfere in the interpretation of this? Because interpretation of an experience also transforms the experience.
Exactly.
So there's the cultural aspects, there's the sensorial direct element to it, and there is finally the generation of making sense out of an experience and meaning, and what does it mean to your life, to your relationships, and also the progression in time during life. I mean, these are not static processes. I don't think that anyone ever achieves enlightenment and stays enlightened. It's always a process.
Or if they do, they certainly don't talk about it.
It's all about the focus on the process and the focus on the practice. And I think that's really, really interesting because it opens up such a broad amount of possibilities.
Do you know whether people are aware, do they ascribe to a certain person? They say, oh, that's my grandmother talking to me. Or do they add a particular real name or real character to those people?
It's interesting, and it kind of links up with what we're talking about, interpreting your experience and how that changes it. Some people do see that these are parts of themselves, something from inside or something that they need to see about themselves. A lot of other of our participants have seen these encounters with this other sort of presence as something really other, as something, really coming from this different dimensions. And
that's an awesome place to wrap up, and I hope that you all continue with this fascinating work that I think answers some of the biggest questions that people have been pondering for millennia. So keep pushing.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks for having me. It was great fun speaking with you guys.
We've got quick fire questions at the end, just to wrap us up.
Sure.
If you weren't doing what you're doing now, what do you think you would be doing instead?
I would try to pursue a career in music. Guitar is my main instrument, but I sing and I play a bit of everything.
Do you want to plug your band?
I have a project called Timmermann with 2 M's, and it's kind of like this Latin American folklore that has synthesizers and hypnotic beats.
Oh, that sounds very cool.
Best way to describe it, yeah.
Does listening to that send you to a state of nirvana?
No.
Is there an emerging field, an emerging area of research that most excites you?
I don't know if this is just a bit endogamic what I'm trying to say, but I think really psychedelic research is fascinating. But also the progress being made in neuroscience right now, and the way that we're looking at the brain, informing the fields of psychology and the field of biology in general, I think is quite exciting. I think that this is truly fascinating because it's generating a shift in how we understand the mind.
Fantastic, thank you. Is there one particular science topic that you think is frustratingly misunderstood?
I would say the way that we think about drugs, between what's illegal and legal, instead of just seeing them as compounds, and more interestingly, our relationship with compounds.
You've spoken a bit about your background in science, but going back a little bit further, do you remember a particular moment when you were first inspired and you first sort of knew that this was something that you wanted to pursue?
I've always been fascinated by the mind, by the workings of the mind.
Do you have a favourite piece of lab equipment?
Oh, wow. Right now, I think just the EEG is just... But the audio recorder in which we conduct interviews, which are really fascinating for me. Yeah, I have no pipette or beaker sort of answer for you for that.
Oh, EEG is pretty cool. And the interesting thing as well is the EEG has been around for a long time. It's not a new piece of equipment.
Yeah, I think that's
But you're
cool.
applying it to something really novel and really cutting edge.
Yeah.
Can you tell us your favourite science or psychedelic joke?
Oh... I guess I'm being silly all the time. I don't have discrete moments of jokes.
Right,
be
Chris,
our challenge.
Thank you so much for
coming
on to WonderLabs
Amazing.
today.
Okay, thank you both for having me and a very exciting conversation. Had a lot of fun. You're listening to WonderLabs, tripping your spirit holes with psychedelic godness.
Nice. Thank you very much.
Excellent.